I'm just going to warm up a little bit while I set things up, because why not? Bound away to Australia. Oh, I was born by the river in a little old tent. And oh, just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. I just feel like singing a little bit deeper tonight. So, I'm gonna take a swig of the good stuff. Water. Ooh, I bet you're wondering how I knew about your plans to make me blue. I can sing tenor if I want to. Alright. Been dinking around for a minute and some change, so let's jump into it. And I hope I'm not pulling the pin on the freaking grenade. Welcome to Psych Talk. I am your host, Sean Hupel, and we're talking psychology and then some. And I totally missed it, the intro, but you know what? You're going to bear with me on this one. So, I've been tackling with a new subject, but not really a new subject, but really defining the base for this subject. And it's one that's affecting all of us right now, today. It doesn't matter where you are, what you are. Because bigotry is a huge thing throughout human history. I mean, honestly, if we were all the same color and some of us had glasses, some of us didn't, we would find a way to discriminate against the other group. Seriously. That's just human nature. But, like right now, racism is a big one, right? But there's more to it than that. I mean, for example, the Native American tribes, they have been saying that the name Redskins is very offensive, and the mascot and all of that is very offensive. I look at that and I say, wow, that makes sense. But for some reason there's an obtuse nature, and that there's kind of a withdrawal from any conversation dealing with differences. It feels like there's a withdrawal. And I'm actually not a fan of all of that. Of course, I'm one of those people where I like to challenge everything, including myself. Excuse me. Coffee is amazing. And I found this amazing, so there's a Northwest company called Columbia. And they have this coffee called Bull Run, bourbon barrel aged. And I just bought a 5-pound bag like 2 weeks ago. We still haven't gotten through half of it. And I drink that stuff almost every day. The neighbors love it and all that because it gives it a more robust flavor. But then I went to Walmart and I found this like Hawaiian wildflower honey. Man, that sets it off. But I've also got another type of honey that I want to sweeten it with. That it's basically a smoky honey. I don't know if it's going to be good or not, but I'm going to try it anyway because America. Speaking of, so we've got this issue of racism going on, but I wanted to trace it back beyond that because racism is just a form of bigotry. So I wanted to go back, okay, why do we naturally find differences in other people and seek to either exploit those differences for advantage? Well, actually, it's almost always toward advantage. Because, think about it this way, you have a different nation, and you want their land, okay, you choose to take it. It's always, well, throughout history, it's been victim and usually conqueror, or previous conqueror, descendants, and so on and so forth. And dang if it didn't ring true in America. But what makes us want to see differences? It boils down to the colloquial. Okay, so what is the colloquial? Like colloquial terms and all that good stuff. Colloquial terms are basically stereotypes turned into words. Okay, so a stereotype is when it happens so often, like bam, 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 back to back with this group. Whatever the group is, okay, it could be a stereotype about Christians or Muslims, white folks, black folks. I mean, and once some stereotypes are true, like, okay, this is to my family and people related to me. There are different ways to make potato salad. And I know right now there are some black folks that are agreeing with me on this one. Because, I mean, I've lived in Southside Chicago, Hilltop, Tacoma, and I've been down south. I mean, they're my second family. My sister, we're not related by blood. My second mother, Mama Williams. I'll just say Mama Williams. Because that's exactly what I call her to her face. And, I mean, it's a fun thing to experience a different culture down south long enough to understand it, and then to be able to speak with somebody else in a completely different environment about that culture. It's kind of an inside joke, isn't it? And we like inside jokes because that gives us a miniature sense of tribalism. Now, the micro sense of tribalism is marriage. And you thought I was just going on a tangent, didn't you? Nope, there's still lessons to be learned here. But these are lessons learned in real life. Because that's where we live. We don't live in the past either. Now, sins of the father, yeah, there's a reason we hold that phrase as a stereotype towards unnecessary vengeance. Because that's what it is. Sins of the father much, basically it's either a repetition of the father's behavior or blaming somebody for the father's behavior. And nowadays it's more recognized as blaming somebody for the father's behavior. Well, you can't really do that. I mean, yeah, I would definitely be hesitant hiring somebody with the last name Hitler and all of that, because I wasn't a fan of Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler apparently had children. But you also can't blame the children for the sins of the parent. I just wanted to throw that out there. Because, I mean, every religion in the world basically says, be nice to other people. Like, at the end of the day, be nice to other people. And it's, I'll just say, politicized interpretation that... Okay, so follow me on this. I have been Kojic since I was 14. I've mentioned this in other videos or other radio shows, right? And Kojic is Church of God in Christ, so full gospel Pentecostal. And I mentioned before, Malachi, I think 3:11, you are cursed with a curse. Like, that actually did haunt me into tithing. No joke. But I've also been behind the pulpit. And I love the fact that my mentor, Dr. Eugene Satterwhite, and my second mentor, Pastor Jeffrey L. Burns, I love the fact that we don't dance around and we don't cherry pick verses. In fact, we challenge each other on them. That's how I met my mentor. Alright, give me a second on this one. Okay, my mentor, former bodybuilder, like full-on former bodybuilder, huge, huge man. Biggest teddy bear in the world. And I love the fact that he's retired and enjoying his beginning to an endless vacation with his wife and all of that. Like, I love them to death. And I've known him since I was 14 because I went to church and about 6 sermons in, I'm like, that's not right. And I challenged him on it at the end of the sermon. Okay, I'm 14 years old, right? So by the time I'm 15, something happens. And I'll never forget this. So I challenged him on a verse, and it's gotten to the point where he already knows where to point me for the context and all of that good stuff. Like, he already knows how I'm coming at him. And like we do this almost every week, and then I stay afterwards, and there was a Bible study afterwards, and then I'd stay after that and learn, because I was really jealous of his book collection. I am functionally autistic, and I never stop learning, and I swear this is all going to tie back to the colloquial. But let me finish the story. So I approach him one day and challenge him on his sermon. He looks down at the paper, because I actually write it out in notes, because that way, he and I can be on the same page. And yeah, he says, "Let me get back to you on this." And I personally felt cheated. I'm like, okay, I've annoyed him enough. God, no. I was so sad that week. And so the next week, you better believe I was tiptoeing extra polite. I was handing him his Bible, which I didn't know was the term for armor bearer, but or had a term called armor bearer. But yeah, I was definitely tiptoeing, because I thought I did something wrong. But then he comes back, he starts the sermon, like he completely passes me up that morning. He says, "I'll talk to you afterwards." In fact, I'm going to try and do the voice that this 6'3", 6'5", easily 250 pounds, and when I met him at that time, he was definitely like, that wasn't fat. That was not fat. Intimidating dude. And I'll try to do his voice. I'll try it. He's gonna kill me when he hears this. All right, so my brothers and sisters in Christ, it has come to my attention that I have misspoken about the Word of God. Not joking, that's exactly how he said it. Not joking. But I had to be elbowed in the ribs because my jaw was on the floor. This man was correcting himself in front of his entire congregation based on a 15-year-old's challenge of his sermon. My grandmother used to always say out of the mouth of babes, in reference to a colloquial term. And I mean, that man, as far as walking the path the Bible dictates, I've never seen a man that walked closer. And I'll say all this to say that we understand colloquially how we are to behave. We understand colloquially how odd that situation I just mentioned that really happened. In fact, he'll be on the show one of these days. But how odd that situation is. Like, it's just, I would have never expected that voice to come out of that man the first time I heard it. And then now I consider him my spiritual father and definitely mentor. In fact, we're co-authoring a book together. Possibly two. But I say all that to say, if you look up Satterwhite versus Port of Tacoma, he was one of 4 people that were discriminated against as far as employment and employment progression. And he was the one of the 4 that won. But he's also the person that restarted the prison ministries in Washington State. I mean, he's a unique individual with a strong heart for people, which is what you would colloquially expect from a pastor. But why do you expect that? Yeah, they have doctrines and whatnot, but it's natural to be selfish, right? And we've seen that. There are churches, I've met pastors that are very selfish. So, what is the separation? Why do we naturally separate? Why do we naturally put people into a stereotype? The stereotype happens so often that we recognize it as a society. One of those moments where somebody says something and they're like, yeah, that's right. You know what I mean? It's that reluctant, like, I hate that you're right. And we recognize that about our own segments in society. It could be the disabled community, the autistic community, the black community, the white community, Latin community, Asian. I mean, I don't want to exclude anybody. But that's where it rests, it rests in a place where we have seen something so many times as a group and as a society that we recognize it to belong to a certain type of people. So what separates that stereotype, which can create implicit bias, meaning, okay, we understand this is what's going to happen, you know? We understand that this is how that situation's going to go down based on the stereotype. And then if it goes differently, that's when it's either a pleasant surprise or disappointing. I've been through both. But where it goes into the colloquial is when it becomes a word, when it becomes defined. That's basically where, societally, it goes from a theory to a law. Think of it like this, as a scientific equivalent. You've got the law of thermodynamics, right? We haven't been able to break that law, and scientists have tried. In fact, every time they try to break it, they end up proving it. Which is something that I like to do myself, is when I'm trying to prove something, I start with trying to disprove it. How is it wrong, and pursue all the way that it's wrong. It's a longer route to take, but it's also one that's more accurate, because when you can no longer like, let's say you come to a conclusion where you're like, hey, I don't know where to go from here. Okay, then you try to disprove what you just proved. And you keep going. That's why I say I shave with Occam's razor, is I keep going until I find when I can't argue with myself any further. And where I can't argue with other people further, because I don't have all the expertise in the world. I mean, I understand what I understand, but at the same time, there's a lot that I don't. You ask me to work on a classic car, I might have an idea. You ask for the modern ones, I know that they have an OBD2 scanner, and I know that most can attach to Bluetooth somehow, some way. I had a T-Mobile sync-up drive, I loved it. But then it became expensive. It became an unnecessary waste. So, where do we place value? I mean, I really, really liked that. But when I stopped driving for Uber and Lyft, because I wanted to network a little bit, I wanted to have some fun, and I wanted to have free time. And once I had that, I got bored. True story. But where do we place our value? So, for a while, it was valuable to me to drive for Uber and Lyft, even though I had literally been held hostage in my own car by, well, held hostage is kind of rough. I know it was 24.7% alcohol by volume in an empty bottle right next to my head, with a guy who was both drunk, well, really, really, really inebriated, who got into the vehicle with his sister. This actually happened, there's a police report and all of that. And it spooked me out of driving the next day, because I barely walked out of that situation, and he had me dead to rights from that position. But I did go back to driving, because at the time, I wanted to drive. I wanted to do some of the projects I was doing on the side. And I enjoyed it. Like, I really enjoyed the freedom, and I was willing to endure and trust in myself to continue to drive. That's where my value was. My value was in experience. Different people have different value systems. And that ultimately determines what we define as good or bad. So, if a certain stereotypical behavior is good or bad, that's on the interpretation of either experience or reference. So reference would be, for example, growing up, if you heard, like in the 90s and early 2000s, if you heard the word thug in the news, right, we automatically know what group that applies to. In fact, that's in movies, it's repeated, it was adopted within those societies because it was so commonplace. In fact, if you were to go into literal terms, or if you were to go into the literal groups, The Paru, which was later known as the Bloods, were actually block protectors because the police weren't showing up to black neighborhoods for hours and hours, and by then the crisis was already over with. So people had to start policing themselves because there were those in poverty that were seeking to create their own advantage. And that happens in all societies. Where there's poverty, there's need. And where there's need, there's different people willing to do different things to achieve that. Okay, we had mobsters back in the early 1900s or late 1800s. Sometime back when they had automatic guns and cars and Bonnie and Clyde and all that good stuff. Their value system was they didn't value themselves too much, but they valued the chase, and they became Bonnie and Clyde. So when we have these stereotypes, such as hearing thug in the news and knowing it references a certain type of person, or at least stereotypically goes to a certain type of person or a profile of a person, if you will, well then throwing the word thug turns it into the colloquial. It turns stereotype into definition. And when we do that, I'll give you an example. I actually met two ladies when I was working at Perfumania in Tempe. I was a 22-year-old, and I actually stayed there until I was like 25 or so, because I really enjoyed the job. I mean, it was one of those where you're talking with people all day, every day, and I was testing my social skills, because I am functionally autistic, and a lot of you can't tell. And that's because of practice. I was constantly testing my limits. But I'm also a different type of person. Everyone is unique, and we are unique unto our interpretation of experience, personal or taught, environmentally taught, coached, all of that. So we learn according to our environment, and our perception of environment is what defines our personality, and ultimately defines what our motivation, what our value systems are, ultimately determining motivation as toward how we progress the rest of our lives. Just got really technical, didn't I? I wasn't trying to. It's just sometimes you roll with the flow, and you roll with the flow. But when we start, the two ladies at Perfumania, sorry. So they actually survived Hotel Rwanda, which, if you ever want to, I think it's Don Cheadle was one of the stars. But go ahead and look it up online. It might be on Netflix or one of those other, Fire Stick or whatever channels that are free. Gosh, I can't think of the one that we've been using, because I just go on the internet. But yeah, if you can go on the free channels, I'm sure Hotel Rwanda is somewhere out there, and give it a watch. But keep in mind, if you've seen Amistad, Roots, all of that, it's going to have the same type of flavor. If you don't like Holocaust films, it's going to have the same type of flavor. It is not for children. But it talks about a very real thing, and I spoke to two ladies that survived it, and they easily were 6 inches taller than me. I'm 5'9", and they were easily, 6 inches, if not a little bit taller than that. And they were twins. And they survived Hotel Rwanda. We actually had a pleasant conversation, and then I sold them a couple perfumes. I actually remember what I sold them. It was Burberry Touch, because they liked the vanilla notes, and it was Flower Bomb, because they loved the multiple notes and the floral scent. See, when I do stuff, I try to master it. Even if it's selling perfume and cologne, even if it's working at Taco Bell. But then again, I'm autistic, which means perfectionist. It kind of comes with the territory. But that's also a stereotype. Perfectionist is a stereotype, and is a stereotype colloquially referring to my kind. My kind belonged to that. But perfectionists can be a lot of different types of people. It can be different signs of people if you're into the astrology stuff. So it could be all of that. Ultimately, what it boils down to is definition and perception. So, a stereotype is defined unto the colloquial, and those two ladies, those beautiful tall women, that, like, they, seriously, their skin glow, like, if they weren't models, I don't know. Um, but just beautiful women that survived a time when they were called cockroaches as children. So, Hotel Rwanda is similar to like the Holocaust, where the Nazis would refer to um, people of Jewish descent or of Jewish religion as vermin or rats, diminutive things that are to be looked down upon. Meaning you took that group and you turned them into a definition. And no single person I've met is a single definition. Now, I've met people where if you meet everyone around them and ask them, hey, what's one word you'd use to describe them? Like if you, my brother and myself, um, we both definitely have stereotypical words. And I'm not going to repeat those on open air. So, but when we start turning something or someone into a definition, it becomes much easier to marginalize, to diminish, to objectify. And we all know the stereotype, don't objectify me. We've heard that phrase. And that's referencing misogyny. And misogyny is a form of bigotry. Bigotry is a type of behavior. And that behavior, once the ego starts kicking in, all of a sudden wants to define things, wants to understand them, or at least place a limited understanding and context. And that's what stereotypes are. And to put that context into context, as something easily referenced instead of explained, you have to turn it into the colloquial. You have to give it a definition and a word. You have to make it a thing. And it's a choice. Sociologically or personally, it becomes a choice as to whether we let stereotypes become a definition. Because when we let stereotypes define others and other groups, then those stereotypes also begin to define us, because they define our perception. They define how we take on the world. If you go back through time, except for the Mayans and the Aztecs, they were weird. And we're going to skip over Enochian and Atlantean theory, right? But if you go into the societies that were good and strong and economically fruitful, there were principal tenets in every religion and every culture about how people should treat each other. Be nice. That's pretty much it. Like, just be honest, be nice, don't be selfish, or at least not too much selfish. Don't take away from somebody else that doesn't belong to you. And ultimately let other people live their own way so long as they don't disenfranchise you. But then you get people that are greedy, that are selfish, that are disregarding, lacking in compassion. We call that lacking empathy, or sociopathy. We have that. We have a term for that too. When you lack empathy, which is understanding other people and being able to at least imagine yourself in their shoes, so that you can understand the context of the situation and perceive it correctly for what it means and for what they're trying to say. So you understand the situation for what it is by understanding everything around it. But what happens when you don't understand? You go back to definition. You have to define a stereotype. You want to lean back on stereotypes. I'll give you a great example of this. So, my mother refused to hit me. Like, she refused it. And that's because her father, my grandfather, was not the nicest person. After the war, he came back different according to everybody that's known him. And because of her childhood, she never ever wanted to take things out on me physically. And then one day, at the ripe age of 11, I mouthed off to her. And just out of reaction, I mean, I got a nice smack, and that was the only time she ever had to hit me. That was the only time. And there was that pause right before, like, huh, huh? Like you're stunned there, you're just looking around. And then, and then it starts to build up. I'm not, ugh. Yeah, I was a mess after that. But she never had to do it again. That's what she knew. That's how she came up. And when you don't know what else to do about something, you react. You fall back to what you do understand of it. And so, if you've got this stereotype, you're trying to understand it, but maybe you kind of don't. You just want to label it as good or bad. That's when you give it definition. The colloquial. And colloquial is how we separate each other. Rats, vermin, cockroaches. Or we can hold somebody to such high esteem that we don't hold them accountable. And I know there's a few people that are out there listening to this like, no, 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 no. I'm not going there. But the fact that you understand and might have had that reaction for a second, thinking, don't go there, that's further proof of the whole concept. Like, we understand stereotypes. We're human beings and we live around each other. Like, we understand these things. But what is the damage of turning something into a definition? Like, okay, now that we understand things, well, they're still part of a group, right? Well, then we have to assess damage. And assessing damage is a very unique cause. Think about it this way. When folks ask for reparations, I kind of lean towards that argument, but I also don't know how it's feasible in so many different ways. And, inflating the economy and so on and so forth, I mean, good, bad, ugly, yeah, that's possible. But here's the deal. Deployment is the challenge with reparations. I firmly believe that the directions we're going, we should go further in them as far as equity and inclusion. Just training out the racism, right? Because that's what it is, even though there's no such thing as a race. Not with humans. There's ethnicities. And ethnicities derive from region, which derive from multiple generations in a certain climate and the human nature to adapt. And we do that in spades. So, what is the damage of the colloquial? Let's dive into this. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. Man, that's amazing coffee though. Seriously, Colombia, I'm not paid to advertise this, nothing like that. I'm just really enjoying this. And I like to share enjoyed experiences. So what's the damage? Alright, I'm giving myself a break. Because, am I not going heavy? Am I not going heavy? Sorry, I thought the camera's over there. Boom, that's fine. But you gotta admit, you're liking these blues, right? These baby blues? See, I need to take a break. So, I'm gonna pause this and do my thing. I'll be back. 28:26. Alright, jumping back in. This is actually the next day, but 28:26 is what I got left to record. So, jumping back into it. The damage comes when you have a group of people that are now marginalized by being labeled colloquially. Okay, these stereotypes now become suddenly fact. To put it in Game of Thrones terms, it is known. And that's kind of where we're at, is people suddenly know things that they never knew before. I mean, we label things, and now it becomes known, the same way that the Earth was flat at one point. But now we know better, and yet you still have dissenters thinking the world is still flat. And that's kind of what we have with racism and bigotry, is until people are more confident or more self-actualized in Maslow terms, then what do you do when, in fact, I talked about this in the episode about the economy, what do you do when you feel trapped? How do you build self-esteem when you feel like there's no self-esteem to be built? There's a glass ceiling that you can't get past. Well, some people, they share the same attitude that I do, which is, if there's a glass ceiling, I'm going to build myself a dang hammer and break it. Or, I'm going to go down trying. But not everybody has that drive. And that's understandable. People want to be comfortable. That is the entire drive of the other episode I talked about, which is the alpha-beta complex. The drive of people is to be secure. And when we're not secure, that's when we start acting insecure. And by acting insecure, that's when we start projecting. And through projecting, we start taking the situation that we don't understand how to get out of, or we just don't understand the situation entirely. And so we feel a little bit scared because we're insecure, and then we start projecting colloquialisms because we have to explain it somehow in a way that we can make sense of, so that we can choose a better direction, or a different direction, or some direction. That's why leadership is important for society. Without leadership, you have a bunch of different people working towards their own ends, their own means. But collectively, a cord of many strands is not easily broken, is it? So, we have people that are, and I gotta admit, our ancestors were right. When I say that, I mean, back in the 80s, my grandmother was complaining about certain things on TV. Then in the 90s, people were, really loud about, okay, our culture is degrading, our culture is degrading. They were right. Again, another episode, in the previous episodes, I really encourage you to, once this reaches podcast, look back at the previous podcasts. This should be viewed in a series because I will be referencing back. But on the same token, you'll learn something. Even if it's just gaining a different perspective or a different way of looking at something you thought you knew. Because I've done that many times. I thought I knew something. There were times when I very much consider myself as a flat earther. Not literally, like I never believed the world was flat. I understand physics, but there were times when I was very obtuse in my stance, and I was unwilling to bend. But the way to prove something is to keep trying to disprove it. And that was something I learned in my 20s or so. Because ultimately, what we have to do is we have to discover who and what we are to understand our surroundings and how we fit into it. And not everybody understands themselves. And so they project that insecurity onto other people because they don't understand themselves, they don't understand their situation, how to get out of it, how to improve their lives. Or they feel a little bit hopeless. Hopeless happens when you don't know where to go. You don't know what to do next. You are hopeless. You're unsure. You're insecure. See how all this is tying together? I need to refresh that. Okay, cool. So, the long story short of this is when we can't understand something, we revert to what is known. Because if other people agree, then at least this makes sense. And that's how stereotypes become colloquial. They become defined. And they become, in their definition, used to define a group of people. What's funny is, pretty much every marginalized group, or somebody belonging to a marginalized group listening to this radio show or watching the YouTube, they know what I'm talking about. I actually belong to a couple marginalized groups. But one thing that's also universal is when there's an immediate threat, sure, people complain. When not, then they don't really complain. If you're in a marginalized group, you can become acclimated to it, and that's the damage. I know people that live in poverty, and they're always trying to get out, but at the same time, they've grown comfortable with where they're at. I can relate to that. I can relate to being comfortable being poor, but also striving for more than that. striving to build myself up, to build up a future, to build up a foundation. But not everybody has the privilege of building up a foundation. Some people have a harder time doing it. And that's where the damage comes into play as well, is implicit bias, because it is known. It is colloquial. See how everything ties together? And once you understand how everything ties together and the motivations behind it for multiple groups, that's when we can start addressing the problem. Because until you understand the problem, you can't start working on a solution. And that's the challenge that people are running into, is they don't fully understand the problem right now. And the problem is, we are insecure as people. As I mentioned before, they were talking about the erosion of America and their culture of America. That was decades ago. And now here we are. We recognize that there are challenges. We recognize that even though our society is technologically connected, we are more disconnected than we have ever been in America. And I will stand by that statement. I'll stand by that one. Like, I'm trying to go through my head, like, how can I be wrong with this one? How can I be wrong with this one? But it's not terribly wrong. In fact, I don't know that it's wrong at all. That's kind of the problem, is when we don't understand that there is a problem, it becomes easier to brush under the rug. Brush under the rug, that's a stereotypical phrase. And it's a colloquialism for ignoring or disregarding issues that could eventually become a buildup. And we simply use the closest analogy to what we wish to define as the word for the colloquial. So, for example, when you want to turn somebody into vermin, something to get rid of, you call them rats and cockroaches, as has been done in history. If you want to look down on somebody systemically, endemically, then all you do is label a group by their skin tone, by their religion. I mean, we saw it in watch Hotel Rwanda. That's a really wonderful video. Or I should say movie. Cinematic flick. Don Cheadle, again, is the, and I think it's 2009 is when Hotel Rwanda, the movie, came out. Which is actually really fast, considering the population and the demographic that directly caters to. Because the Tuskegee Airmen, that took, 80 years for them to make a movie about the flying aces of World War I that had a significant impact on how that war turned out. But we're getting beside the point here. The long story short is, only through insecurity do we feel the need to label, because in insecurity we're unsure. We don't know what the outcome is, we don't know what the situation or environment is. There's something that's making us feel insecure and perceiving a potential threat. And in that state, it becomes very easy to exacerbate that state and further influence whether or not we see something as a threat, or whether or not we see something as, or someone as somebody that we can victimize. My girlfriend has been victimized very recently. Thankfully, everything turned out alright. We've got the police involved. But, yeah, it's one of those where racism is still a very real thing in the United States. I've seen it firsthand. So has my lady. So has my sister from another mother. So has my other mother. I've got friends left and right that have seen racism, and that's the one that keeps coming up because that's the one that we can deal with right now. There's a challenge with trying to solve problems that you don't understand, so why not define a problem instead of defining the colloquialism? Handle one, move on to the next. LGBTQ rights, I mean, they're still under threat. Voting rights, still under threat. And there's absolutely, I know people that work in voting, and there's no reason to be doubting our election system right now. There's absolutely none. It's extraordinarily secure compared to pretty much any other previous election. With technology, we've become a lot more secure. What's not secure is free speech. What I mean by that is people have a lot of free speech, but we aren't pursuing the remedies to harmful free speech. We have remedies in place. We have legal remedies. And companies and corporations have remedies in place. It's just they aren't using those remedies, and that's generally out of fear. See, fear can cause us to freeze in place, or fear can cause us to move. There's not really an in-between when you're fearful. Now, when you're not fearful, that's when you can process everything without ulterior motivation, such as survival or getting rid of an annoyance. An annoyance that maybe you don't understand except by the colloquial. You understand what is known. You see how everything ties together here? But now we have an understanding, we have a foundation in this conversation of, okay, we recognize that there is a mechanism towards security or towards self-esteem that ultimately results in people defining another group colloquially, so giving them a label instead of recognizing them as a group of individuals. That's the problem, is when people start looking down on another group, they forget that they themselves are an individual, as are the members of whatever group they prescribe to. And ultimately it's leading to division, which is, again, I'm going back to the culture divide because, to reference the earlier episode I started to reference, third generation. That's the make it or break it. So, and that's colloquially known as, like, third generation is a thing. Especially in wealthier communities and whatnot, until you make it past 3 generations, you are new money. New money means that, okay, the first generation made it. The second generation watched them make it. The third generation, they just inherited it. So did they also get the lessons from the second and first generation, or did they not? And did they receive those lessons, or did they not? And if they don't, that's why third generation is usually when a lot of wealthy families will lose everything. Because the people at the bottom feel entitled. So what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Where we're at right now in America is we are kind of third generation right now. The baby boomers made the money. My generation, the millennials, saw them make the money. And then you've got this new generation that's just basically inheriting everything. They're going to be inheriting problems, but they're also inheriting all the technology and all the wonderful things that have been developed pre their lifetime, unto their current lifetime. But we haven't held on to our morals and ethics that help define the country. Like, we had them more in the past. Like, as a group, as a society, we had better morals in the past, and they've been eroding and eroding and eroding. And unfortunately, that's impacting the next generation because, like, for example, I've heard some serious name-calling, and there's a game called Fortnite that I play with my best friend and brother, but I also play it with his kids. And one of the things that, like, they teach and encourage poor sportsmanship in Fortnite, because after you kill somebody, you can dance over them, or dance over where they were, and the other person will still be able to see you dancing there. And that's a demoralizing tactic, but at the same time, these kids are encouraged by that. They keep fighting to be able to have the right to dance on somebody else and to get a dub or a win. Dub stands for W, which is the first letter of win. And in the rush of this new generation, they are truncating, which means they are omitting certain fundamentals that the older generations would be like, what are you doing? Because they're always the new generation's always in a rush, and they're not as connected as they used to be. It's easier to say something online when you're playing with your friends, which is what happened throughout COVID, majorly. And the bullies get a lot braver. Though it does become easier to band together online too. So bullies can band together and attack, but also good people can band together and protect each other. And that's kind of what we need to do as a society, is say whatever you want about the gaming community, we solve problems. Like the misogyny issue that was going around, like girls can't game, we solved it as a community. When it came to interracial, playing video games and whatnot, we solved that racism thing real quick. You better believe that. In fact, I used to write for the Gamerholics magazine. I wrote a couple articles and video game reviews. And I was also a literal video game tester, and I'm a Dreamcast aficionado. I love video games because video games teach solid morals. Number one, you've got to save the defenseless. Number two, the harder things get, the more you know you're moving in the right direction. Number three, you've got to sometimes figure out a problem all the way through and be thorough. Otherwise, if you forget an earlier step, later on you won't be able to complete the game. There are so many lessons and problem-solving skills taught to video gamers that are lifelong gamers, but you also got to temper it. You got to make sure you don't let them get addicted, because I might have dived down the deep end once or twice. But that's also a learning experience. And right now, America's in a learning experience. We're experiencing growing pains because some people are relative to an ideology, yet they're stuck in the middle. What does that mean? That means that some people are used to racism. They're used to implicit bias, so much so that they don't even acknowledge that it's there. And I get it. I've been on both sides of the fence in this argument. But it's not just racism. It's not just religionism, like anti-Semitic versus Semitic and so on and so forth. Those are just talking points. And what we've got to do is get past the talking point, get past the colloquial, and start looking at the individuals and recognizing that, okay, in that scenario, in that environment, whether it's poor, whether it's wealthy and whatnot, we very much would be those people, because there are only a certain amount of personality archetypes, and then from there it just becomes our own personal decisions and motivations. And that's generally based on the morals and values that we were raised with. I can't tell you how many times I have been grateful to be raised by a woman that was about to be a literal nun. A literal nun. She sewed quilt tops at Christ Lutheran Church over in Salem. She sewed quilt tops for the homeless. She had such a strong impact on my life because my parents were always working. Again, I'm second generation. My parents made the money, and they aren't people I want to learn lessons from, but I can learn from their mistakes. And that sometimes is all we can do, is learn from mistakes. We've made mistakes in the past as a society. Now, are we responsible for the past? No. Are we responsible for the present? Oh, you better believe it. And to not be responsible for the present is, number one, lazy, but number two, it's unpatriotic, because our country was built on the foundations of inclusion, whether by religion, race, age, creed, you name it. A cord of many strands is not easily broken. That is wisdom unto itself. And it's repeated through multiple different cultures and multiple different histories. It's even in The Art of War by Xunzi, but most of you know him as Sun Tzu. But yeah, The Art of War, it's even in there. The equivalent to A Cord of Many Strands. I know, because I read that book and I need to read it again this year. Read it once a year and it will give you, it's kind of like reading Proverbs. Whether or not you're religious or whether or not you're warlike, there is genuine knowledge and power in that knowledge. Like, there's a reason both have survived for thousands of years. Like, that's good writing. And it's fundamental writing, and it goes back down to the core. Kind of like how we just went into Colloquial to define basically the definitions of bias. I mean, Colloquial defines bias by labeling it and turning it into a thing that we can use to objectify another person instead of recognizing the other person for who they are. And if you talk to the older folks, the older folks, like, I love old folks, especially ones they're on their way out, meaning they got a terminal illness. I love the knowledge that they give you, because there's no bias anymore. It's just, okay, you know what? Here's the real deal. And then you can get some real knowledge from them. And I love that, because each and every one of them values relationships at the end of their life. Not their material things and whatnot, but relationships and the legacy that they left as having a positive impact. And the ones that have a negative impact, they have a negative recollection. In fact, a lot of them are ashamed. That's when the apologies start coming out. Because at the end of life, we realize that it's just about relationships, and it's about building those friendships and maintaining those friendships and enjoying this experience on Earth. I don't know if you believe in an afterlife or not. I'm not trying to push none of that either. But no matter what, we only got one lifetime. And what we do with it is ultimately what defines ourselves, but it also defines our progeny, the people that come afterwards. And do we want to leave everything up in the air, ambiguous as all get out? Or do we want to leave something stronger for the next generation? Well, that comes from not being lazy in this generation. And that comes from not being lazy and fearful and apprehensive to approach the difficult topics. We need to approach the difficult topics and, to use a colloquial phrase, man up. That's a colloquial phrase. Okay, it's not really a stereotype, but it's a colloquial phrase. And manning up, which, again, not trying to be misogynistic, even though when it was created, yeah, that phrase was kind of misogynistic, but, dismissively so. Backtracking, so manning up means to own up responsibility for one's involvement and capability to solve a situation. One's involvement with and capability to solve a situation. I love defining things. The problem is when we over-define, we begin to marginalize. We begin to have permission, give ourselves permission to label. And that's not a good thing. We all know that. None of us wants to be a label. So why do that to somebody else, And I guess at the end of the day, it's all about relationships. It always will be about relationships. The relationships we form with other people, the relationships that we form with ourselves. Because we gotta get to know ourselves too. We can't just leave it to getting to know everybody else. How can you get to know somebody else if you don't understand yourself? And that's why pretty much every culture and religion and blah 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 up till the beginning of time talks about, hey, meditate a little bit. In fact, believe it or not, every culture at some point talks about fasting too, which is now backed up by scientific evidence. You go 18 hours without eating or drinking anything but water, all of a sudden your body starts releasing stem cells and is able to fight off a whole lot more things or heal a whole lot more things because your body just received permission through stress to release stem cells. True story. In fact, I thought that was very fascinating. They don't get released as much without fasting. All of these ancient people had the right idea, but they all talked about inclusion too. They talked negatively about wars and about conflict, and about how peace and unity and working with nature and all of that good stuff actually works. And here we are, like I'm over in Lebanon, and it's hot. Hotter than usual, okay? We can choose to believe the experts on global warming and all of that good stuff, or we could choose to believe unto our own knowledge and the colloquial. We can choose to believe that other races, even though race isn't a thing, it's ethnicity. But we can choose to take people's words that are misdefining words and definitions to say, oh, this group is like that. And because you look this way, you are like that. I've been there in that accusatory stance because I didn't know better. If you're listening to this show, now you do know better. Get to know somebody. Are some stereotypes true? Yes, for every single group, there are some stereotypes that are multilaterally applicable, but not unilaterally. They don't apply to everybody of that group. In fact, you'd be surprised how stereotypes generally come from an inconvenient minority, meaning a small portion of this one group that's being labeled is behaving poorly, but we remember the bad things people do a lot more than we remember the good things people do. And that's another stereotype that all of you know because it happens so much. I'm not saying anything new here, I'm just tying a puzzle together and explaining a few things in terms that I hope every one of you can understand. Okay, there's fundamental value in being willing to accept other people's differences because those differences are what made us the dominant species on the planet that has still survived. I mean, presumably we survived an ice age, right? That's a thing to survive. And then we've survived so many different wars as a country. But as a species, we dominated the planet, and now we're prospecting other planets to conquer. We did this all by coming together and refining our resources, by recognizing that the differences in one another can lead ultimately to strength. So I'm going to cut this off probably a few seconds early, but you guys stay safe out there. Try to be accepting of others. Get vaccinated, please. And try to keep an open mind when dealing with somebody new. Nobody knows their story. Take care. Autistic Commando on YouTube and Adornus on Twitter. Huh. I did it. With seconds to spare. Later, y'all.